Hello, everybody. I will present you the Professor Nicolas Jaspert. I think everybody here knows Professor and his work, okay, along these years about the Middle Ages. And Professor Nicolas Jaspert is since October 2013 Professor of Medieval History at the University of Heidelberg, and from 25 to 2013 was Professor for History of the Middle Ages with special emphasis on the late Middle Ages at the Universität of Bochum. And his main areas of interest and research is Mediterranean, as we can see on the last book he presented, especially Iberian history of the Middle Ages, transcultural entanglements, history of orders, religious history, religious violence, German-Spanish relations. Between 2017 and 2019, a professor was co-director of the Cluster of Excellence Asia and Europe in a global context in the University of Heidelberg, and since 2017, co-director of the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies. Since 2018, member of the Humanities Panel of the Swiss National Science Foundation and co-director of the Heidelberg Center for the Ibero-American Studies. And since 2020, member of the Heidelberg Academy of Science and Humanities. In addition to other journals, he is member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the journal Anuário de Estudos Medievais that we all know. Among his latest publications, we can highlight the following titles, of course, besides of that one that the professor presents. In 2022, the Discourses of Purity in Transcultural Perspective with Matthias Bley. In 2016, Locating Religions, Contact Diversity and Translocality with Reinhold Gley. Also in 2016, The Hospitallers, the Mediterranean and Europe. Festrich, this is German, for Anthony Luther with Karl Borchardt. And in 2010, The Crusades. These are just a few examples, okay? Professor Jaspert is also an advisor on our research project, the project that we are presenting and submitted to FCT, entitled Landscapes of Pilgrimage in Medieval Portugal, People, Past and Rituals, which we hope will soon receive funding. Precisely these seminars and the Peregrinações network is precisely one of the results of this project. The title of his conference that he brings us today is Material Actants of Jerusalem Pilgrimage in Late Medieval Iberia. Professor, thank you very much, and the word is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm happy to be here. Sorry, I can't speak Portuguese, but please pose questions in English, Spanish, German, of course, or in Portuguese very, very, very slowly, then perhaps I'll be able to understand. I'm not sure if you can see this now. Is it uploaded already? The presentation?
It is.
Okay.
Yes, we just have to put in full screen. Yeah, now it's in full screen. Right? Yeah.
Okay. All right, and I'll read this text and hope it's more understandable that way.
Okay.
It's about Jerusalem. Jerusalem, city of the Old Testament, covenant of Israel with God, scene of the life and suffering of Christ, real physical city situated in Palestine, place of the final judgment. It is beyond doubt that the city of David has an outstanding significance for the images and memorabilia of the medieval world. This is also true for the Iberian Peninsula, as countless examples show. We need only recall the legend of the arrival of the body of the Apostle James. He undertook a miraculous journey across the Mediterranean from Jerusalem to Galicia, supposedly performing several miracles on his arrival on Iberian soil. Thus, from very early on, both Jerusalem and the Mediterranean Sea played an important role in the legends of the Translatio of St. James. The saint's relationship with the Mediterranean was even reinforced by hagiographic miracula, as Klaus Herbers has recently demonstrated once again. After the establishment of the Jacobean cult in Compostela, and at the time of the emergence of pilgrimage routes to Galicia in the 13th century, incidentally, or the 12th century, incidentally, an essential terrestrian route, the famous Codex Calixtinus or Liber Sancti Jacobi reported on the miracles that the saint had supposedly worked on the Mediterranean. In the second book of the Liber Sancti Jacobi, 22 miracle stories are told, and you all know this. Stories 7, 8, 9, and 10 are devoted to the theme of St. James and Jerusalem. That is not so well known. They all date from the year 1101 to 1104, that is shortly after the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 by Christian crusaders. And I'm going to go through these stories, but very shortly. The first, number 7, tells the story of a sailor named Phrysonos, whom the apostle saves from an attack by a Muslim pirate on the Mediterranean, and the supposed dialogue between the apostle and the Muslim, called Avitus supposedly, is significant. The Muslim asks the saints, and I quote, "Are you the God of the sea to oppose our people at sea?" And the apostle immediately replies, "I'm not the God of the sea, but only a disciple of the God of the sea. I help those at sea and on land who are in danger and who call out to me just as God wills." End of citation. And the story continues. I continue citing. "Immediately, by the power of God and the help of James, the strong ship of the Saracens was hit by a storm. The ship of the Christians, on the other hand, steered by James, with God's help, reached the desired place." End of the citation. The second story, story number 8, tells of a prelate who was on his way back from Jerusalem on a ship when a strong wave threw him over and some others, travelers, into the sea. They were immediately sailing away from the ship when he called on James, who soon rescued him. The third story, number 9, tells of a Frankish knight from Tiberias who promised to undertake a pilgrimage to the tomb of James, then forgot his promise. Only after serious illness and a vision did he finally set out, but the ship on which he was traveling encountered bad weather and was in danger of being wrecked. And I cite, "Immediately the blessed apostle appeared to the frightened people on the ship in the form of a man and said to them, 'Do not be afraid, my dear children. Here I am, the one you were calling.' And of course, immediately he untied the sails, calmed and soothed the storm, and there was a great silence on the sea." The last miracle is about another pilgrim on the way back from Jerusalem who falls overboard and calls out to Santiago, and a companion on the ship throws his shield into the sea with the words, "The glorious apostle St. James, whose help you will call, will save you." And indeed, the pilgrim takes the shield and swims in the wake of the ship for 3 days and 3 nights through the waters of the sea with the help of St. James, and thus he arrives safely with the others at the desired port. Now, 4 miracles stories that share 2 things in common. On the one hand, Santiago helps both on sea and by land. On the other hand, this maritime aid always occurs in the Mediterranean, not in the Atlantic. Thus, the authors of the Liber Sancti Jacobi put the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and St. James in very close relationship. One gets the impression that the Compostellan leaders, above all, of course, the famous Archbishop Diego Ramirez, wanted to integrate the Jerusalem pilgrimage, on the rise since the conquest in 1099, into their own political conception of a Jacobean cult. The composers of the miracle stories seem to have selected these stories deliberately to link the piety to Jerusalem to their patron saint. And according to these stories, the apostle even had dominion over the space most intimately connected with pilgrimage to Jerusalem, namely precisely the Mediterranean Sea. Comparatively speaking, he thus showed himself to be the most powerful intercessor of all the saints, giving Compostela an advantage over Compostela's competitors, that is, Rome and Jerusalem. Through these stories, and of course through the physical presence of the saint's body from Palestine, Jerusalem and the Mediterranean were places permanently linked to the Jacobean cult. This close relationship was reinforced precisely in the first decades of the 12th century by institutionalized links between the cathedral chapter of the houses of Santiago or Compostela and Jerusalem. Around 1119, the two signed a partnership a promise to perform regular prayers for the benefit of the other, and reinforced these links in the years between 1128 and 1130. On these occasions, canons, clergymen from Jerusalem and Compostela, who were sent as ambassadors to their respective lords, the patriarch and the archbishop, acted as trans-Mediterranean and transcultural actors. Now, they cannot, and that's the point, obviously cannot be considered material actants, as this title of my paper says. In what follows, therefore, I will abandon hagiographic texts and concentrate mainly on material artifacts in order to show how trans-Mediterranean links between Jerusalem and the Iberian Peninsula were brought about through material objects. These, no doubt, could develop their own potency, their own agency, and therefore I want to qualify them as actants, thus picking up on a term coined by the French sociologist and philosopher Bruno Latour to subsume both human and material things which act. Latour attributes to both of these their capacity to act. To find some examples of trans-Mediterranean and transcultural actants, we do not have to go far from Compostela. In the Holy Chamber of Oviedo, as you all I'm sure know, we find, probably since the end of the 10th century, the famous Holy Ark, the Arca Santa. It is an exceptional example of how Jerusalem, or rather the concept of Jerusalem, was able to develop a high symbolic and political impact in the Middle Ages on the Iberian Peninsula through material objects. The Holy Ark is a wooden reliquary in the form of a large chest, as you see, made around 1096, 1097. The dating is not quite secure, covered with silver carved in Romanesque bas-reliefs. It contains a large number of relics, supposedly from the Holy Land, the most famous of which is the Holy Shroud. Some of these relics date back to the Old Testament, supposedly. The vast majority refer directly to the Holy Land, to Palestine, to Jerusalem, and I'll just enumerate them. The milk from the Virgin Mary, a piece of the true cross, a piece of the crown of thorns, a stone of the sepulchre, earth that Christ trod on when he ascended to heaven, the shroud, blood of the image wounded by the Jews during the ascent to Calvary, manna, St. Peter's pouch, St. Andrew's pouch, the manger where baby Jesus was, St. Peter's sandals, the hair of Mary Magdalene, and others more. The number and the quality of the objects collected in Oviedo was of such magnitude that the Asturian city became in the 12th century a considerable point of pilgrimage, a detour on the way to St. James to Compostela. Significantly, Oviedo, texts from Oviedo, began to link the Holy Ark with Jerusalem in the decades after the Crusade, after the First Crusade. At the same time that Jerusalem and Compostela, the cathedral chapters, were strengthening their relationship, and precisely when the author of the Codex Calixtinus was endeavoring to link Compostela with the Mediterranean and Palestine through the narration of supposed Jacobean miracles that occurred at sea. At an undetermined time, between 1109 and 1130, Bishop Pelayo of Oviedo had the Liber Testamentorum Ecclesiae Ovetensis written. As you see here, this cartulary, as you see, includes the story of the supposed transfer of relics, the ones from Oviedo, from Jerusalem to Asturias by the disciples of the apostles. According to this account, these objects first went to Africa, then to Toledo, where they were venerated in the time of the Metropolitan Ildefonso, and after the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, they were transferred to Asturias. The relics remained there until King Alfonso II built a church dedicated to St. Michael in Oviedo and placed the ark there. The account in the Liber Testamentorum closes with a list of the relics, which includes a crux opere angelico fabricata spectabili modo. Around the same time, the Leonese author of the so-called Historia Silense presented a variation of this account. he has the Ark sail from Jerusalem to Seville. From there, supposedly it's transferred to Toledo, where it remained for 100 years. At the time of the Muslim invasion, the Ark traveled, similar to the legend of the body of St. James, by ship to a port in Asturias near Gijón. The author adds the miraculous story of the cross of the angels, the work of two celestial spirits who disguise themselves as pilgrim craftsmen. Thus, both the Liber Testamentorum Ecclesiae Ovetensis and the Historia Silense can be interpreted as outstanding attempts to link the Asturian monarchy, and more specifically the episcopal see of Oviedo, with Jerusalem through very specific trans-Mediterranean actants, the relics of the Holy Ark and other treasures kept in the Holy Chamber of Oviedo. The famous Cross of the Angels and of Oviedo shows that such a link had even arisen before the 12th century, for let us not forget that the great crosses of Oviedo, which you see here, the Cross of the Angels and the Cross of Victory, made clear reference to Jerusalem in their very form of a crux gemata, which is reminiscent of the legendary cross that Constantine and his mother Helena supposedly erected on Golgotha. However, it was only under the pontificate of Pelayo that this link was highlighted in this very concrete fashion as a productive appropriation, so to speak, through the narratives of the Liber Testamentorum Ecclesiae Ovetensis and other texts, which as a whole form part of what is called the Corpus Pelagianum. It's not surprising that the Jerusalem relics in turn then worked miracles in the strict sense of the word. In the late 12th and 13th century, the Narratio de Relíquias a Hierosolima Ovetum usque translatis tells how the relics vigorously defended Christians against Muslim attackers, causing arrows and spears that were sent towards them to miraculously turn round and fall on the attackers. It is not difficult to see how the Jerusalem relics gathered in the Ark served important and very real, even political functions. They elevated the See of Oviedo on a par with the young Metropolitan Church of Compostela. They emphasized the importance of the Asturian city as a royal city, and ultimately they postulated a translatio from Jerusalem via the ancient royal city of Toledo to the new royal city of Oviedo. However, despite the efficacy of these objects gathered in the Holy Chamber of Oviedo, their true Jerusalem origin could not be proved by contemporary texts, that is, by texts written in the 9th or 10th centuries. For the Liber Testamentorum and the Historia Silense are, of course, later texts that explained the presence of the objects in Oviedo, but they cannot be considered as documents written in Jerusalem at the time of the creation of these artifacts and sent to Europe with the artifacts. And that's why, on the contrary, this is the case of another group of objects that I want to refer to in the next part of my paper. For many years, and actually for many centuries, the parish church of Anglesola, located 80 kilometers east of Lleida in Catalonia in Spain, has preserved 8 fragments of the true cross inside a medieval reliquary. And that's the object you see here. These Sanctis Virtuts, as they named by the parishioners, have survived, albeit in a rather deteriorated state, as you see, the many vicissitudes that the church has experienced, including several attempts at theft. Some parishioners of Anglesola would possibly attribute its survival to the miraculous power of the cross, since as early as the 14th century, the inhabitants of the village took it for granted that its relic even had power to intercede with God against the elements, since in 1362, the leading figures of Anglesola reached an agreement with the rector of the parish church that one of the clerics would climb the church bell tower with the lignum crucis every time that bad weather approached. Now, some years ago, actually quite a while ago, I demonstrated that the Anglesola cross came directly from Jerusalem, where it was made in the second half of the 12th century. And this position has been taken up and verified by recent scientific analysis of the piece that has given rise to an exhibition of the true cross of Anglesola and the pilgrimages from Catalonia to the Holy Land held in summer 2014. For this reason, I'll limit myself to summarizing the most important points that I explained some time back. A few weeks after the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, a part of the true cross, that is, the cross on which Christ supposedly died, which Saint Helena supposedly found in the 4th century, and which was hidden in the 7th century to protect it from the Muslim invasion, was rediscovered. This true cross, Vera Crux, quickly became the most important relic of the young kingdom of Jerusalem. It became a symbol of the Crusader states and their most precious treasure. On more than 30 occasions during the 8 decades until the end of the First Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187, this relic was carried in battle against Muslims to boost the morale of the Christian fighters. The true cross of Jerusalem was also of considerable political importance. It was the crystallization point of the royal house and of the Jerusalem patriarch. It was the relic was given to the patriarch and to his chapters, the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, so that they became the custodes sanctissimi sepulchri, and they also became the custodes crucis domini. It, the cross, acquired a place of preeminence within the Jerusalem liturgy, and the feast of its elevation was celebrated with special zeal. Thanks to studies written almost half a century ago by a German historian called Heribert Meurer, we know that from the 3rd decade of the 12th century, goldsmiths' workshops existed in Jerusalem where reliquaries of the true cross were made, so-called Staroteche. That's what you see here. The craftsmen probably depended on, or at least collaborated with, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and its superior, that is, the patriarch, in whose immediate vicinity they had their workshops in Jerusalem. Today, we know a few works of this Jerusalem workshop, and then you're seeing them here: the crosses of Santiago de Compostela, of Paris, of Agrigento, and I'll show you 2 more, of Troia and of Castel Sant'Elia near Nepi. The last 2, these 2 you see here, actually recent discoveries to a certain extent. They've been added to these groups, to this group lately. Now, these pieces are not identical, but they are strikingly similar. There's not the slightest doubt that they were made at the same place, even with the same tools. And I'm showing you all 6 of them here, and you can compare the crosses, and it's very clear that they've been made at the same place. Locally, both these relics and their receptacles, the so-called Staroteche or Starothex, that is, reliquaries of the double cross, the caskets in which these fragments were inserted, were points of crystallization of popular devotion. These reliquaries had a characteristic shape that contemporaries associated directly with Jerusalem. They thus created a direct and easily identifiable relationship between recipient and content, to such an extent that they can be described as speaking or talking reliquaries. It was precisely the visualization of the relic that guaranteed a better participation in the divine power attributed to the relics themselves, their virtus, their presentia. Thus, the religious devotion, memories, and collective emotions of medieval believers were concentrated both on the relics and on their containers, making them an important element of social cohesion, both relics and reliquaries. For the specific focus of this paper, the function of object as trans-Mediterranean actants, it is of great interest to know how the Jerusalem Staroteche, how the Jerusalem reliquaries made their way from Jerusalem across the Mediterranean to Latin Europe. Now, in many cases, such as the Vera Cruz of Anglesola, the one on the left, the red picture, we can only formulate some well-founded theories. In other cases, however, we have more reliable material evidence. Generally, these Staroteche or Starothecs were sent with persons and documents attesting to their authenticity. Jerusalemite canons, for example, clergymen, were sent from Palestine to Europe as collectors of alms. To facilitate their task, relics of the true cross were given with them or to them. This is evident from a document which you see here, preserved in the Bavarian State Archives in Munich, sealed and signed by Patriarch Fulker, which was given to a canon of the Holy Sepulchre called Conrad for his journey to Europe. The Patriarch relates having had the relic made and presents the bearer of the relic. Thus, the sealed document of the Patriarch gives greater authenticity to both the emissary and to the artifact itself. To the case of Conrad, others could be added with similar accounts of the sending of Jerusalemite canons and relics to the Christian West, for example, to Paris in 1109 or to Compostela in 1128-30. The seal of this letter, written during the years 1155 to 57, which accompanied the relic of the True Cross, is a good example of another type of highly symbolic mobile artifact. Like relics and reliquaries, Jerusalemite seals not only refer to distant places, but also function as actants themselves that develop a force of their own in their places of arrival, where they were integrated into new contexts. They experienced what we could call an artifact biography or an artifact career. Such new forms of social action by material objects often took place in public space and had a performative dimension, as documents were often presented, read out aloud in public space, publicly, and in such occasions, seals played an important authenticating role. The relics and the reliquaries that served for the display of the fragment of the True Cross could also mark the public space outside churches as they were shown around the towns in processions. Above all, they served in the liturgy of the churches themselves. Such performative acts exposed the Starothecs to the faithful, presenting them in public space. Significantly, and that's what you see here on the right-hand side, the bases of some Starothecs allowed them to be attached to poles. You see at the bottom of the cross, there's a possibility to attach a pole. As, for example, in the Cheyenne cross, you can see this also. The reliquary does not exist anymore, but what you see on the left is the contemporary container in which it was transported, and the container also shows that, similar to the cross in Santiago de Compostela, it also had the same foot so that you could attach a pole to it. A particularly striking image illustrating the purchase, transport, and arrival of a Starothek in the West is held today amongst the treasures of the Basilica of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. It is a late 12th century reliquary in the form of an enameled box, and its walls, as you see here, show the transfer of a relic and its container from the Holy Land to Europe, literally telling the story how the True Cross arrived to Toulouse. And it all starts far back with a picture of Saint Helena and the finding of the True Cross. You see this, Judas finds 3 crosses with his, tool in the ground, similar to pictures we know from later periods. I've just taken as an example, a painting from the late 15th century, which is just around the corner in Darmstadt, where you also see Saint Helena, the Queen, and the finding of the 3 crosses. But then, very quickly, the scene changes on the body of the box, and we are introduced to the 12th century. We see how the abbot of the monastery of Saint Josaphat in Jerusalem gives a piece of the true cross to a certain Raimundus Botardelli. Abbas Josaphat de Crucidat Raimundus Botardelli. And you see that the Staroteche is very similar to what we have seen, actually. We're talking about a similar kind of object. In the following image, we see an excellent representation of maritime transport. The text reveals that Raimundus is shown embarking for Europe with the relic, hic intrat mare. Once there, the traveler from Jerusalem hands over the treasure to the abbot, and the text tells us that this is Abbot Pontius, that Abbati Pontius. This, in fact, helps to date the event because a certain Pons de Montpezat was the abbot of the monastery of Saint-Cernin in Toulouse from 1176 to 1198. However, the real beneficiary of the precious donation is not Abbot Pons, but rather Saint-Cernin himself, the saint whose mortal remains were worshipped at Saint-Cernin de Toulouse and to whom the monastery is dedicated. Because finally, in the end of the scene, we see Raymond kneeling in the circle of his canons, of his brothers, handing the cross to the saint. Thus, by contemplating and reading this reliquary, anyone could get a direct view of the journey of the relic from Jerusalem across the Mediterranean Sea to Toulouse. And I'll just show you shortly a very similar object, in fact, a portable altar, which was given to Princess Sancha of Leon by, as the inscription says, by the Bishop of Bethlehem, Anselmo, and the inscription also tells you all the relics that this object contains, 19 relics, all referring to the Holy Land, as you see here in the inscription. Now, this Toulouse reliquary and the piece which you see here are exceptionally explicit because they give us information. As a rule, however, we do not know how relics reached the respective churches where they were worshipped, and this is why reliquaries were so important. They served to give authenticity and to increase the confidence of the believers in the relics. At the same time, they indicated their contents. But most relics were not kept in talking containers of this kind. Many of the containers no longer exist, or were never very expressive. And that is why in the last two sections of this paper, I would like to present two types of historical texts that can help uncover trans-Mediterranean connections, documents that are rarely considered in order to discover relations between Palestine and the Iberian Peninsula, and perhaps also to Actants. When a church is consecrated or reconsecrated, certificates were issued as written records of the act. In the northeast of the Iberian Peninsula, in Catalonia, many of these so-called dotalies have been preserved. A few years ago, the Catalan historian Ramon Ordeici Mata compiled and edited 450 of these dedication charters. Among these are also documents that provide us with information about relics. Around 100 of these consecration contain documents or references to relics. As a rule, these relics were solemnly given to the church during the consecration and kept in the altar. Is it worth examining these relics to find out which saints or which regions they came from? Perhaps the consecration documents of medieval churches provide information about unknown Jerusalemite objects and trans-Mediterranean actants. An analysis of all relics mentioned by Ordeici Mata shows, as we might expect, that the vast majority of the saints came from the Iberian Peninsula, the south of France, and from Italy. However, a not insignificant proportion came from the Holy Land. These relics include objects such as the sponge used to cleanse the body of Jesus, bread from the Last Supper, parts of the Nativity crib, pieces of the True Cross, and of the Holy Sepulchre. In particular, these two last named objects, the True Cross and the Holy Sepulchre, are mentioned particularly frequently, namely in 8 and 9 churches, respectively. Sometimes they're mentioned together, as it seems that some churches created small collections of Jerusalem or Palestine relics. The Benedictine monastery of San Esteve de Banyoles, or Santa Maria de Ripoll, which you see here in particular stand out in this respect. This is especially instructive in the case of Ripoll, because this community also used other means, such as manuscripts, but also the famous western facade of the Abbey Church, what you see on the right-hand side at the bottom, to invoke Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Returning to the saints, it is possible to list a whole group of biblical figures linked to Jerusalem and whose relics were kept in Catalan churches, above all, of course, Mary, but also apostles such as Andrew, Mark, John, James, Peter, and Paul. New Testament and apocryphic characters such as St. James the Baptist, Martha, Gamaliel, Lazarus, Nicodemus, the Holy Innocents, martyrs such as Stephen, and early Christian bishops of the Holy Land such as Babylon and of Antioch. Other sources provide additional information, as two examples might illustrate. In the first of these, according to a sermo in Dedicatione Ecclesiae Sancte Mariae Revipulenses, in 1032, pieces of the True Cross and of the Holy Sepulchre were placed under the altar when the new church of Ripoll was consecrated. The second example is when Ramon Arnay, son of Clemencia, swore allegiance to the Count Guillaume of Cerdagne for the castle of Sos sometime between 1068 and 1095. When he did this, he did so in the church of Santa Maria de Cornellà on a relic of the True Cross, as the Charter of Allegiance says. Now, of course, we are historians, and as historians, we are not interested in the question if these relics were genuine or were fake. That's not our interest. And of course, it cannot also always be assumed that these relics were actually acquired in the Holy Land. The bodies of the apostles, for example, supposedly rested outside Palestine. Even Jerusalemite relics could have been acquired elsewhere. Just to give you an illustrative example, I would mention a letter written around the year 1040 by the bishop and abbot Oliba to a Catalan magnate, Arnau Mir de Tost, in which he relates how Oliba had obtained relics of the True Cross, the Holy Sepulchre, and the clothes and shoes of Mary, but not in Palestine, but in Lodi, in Italy. Other sources, however, explicitly mention the acquisition of relics in Jerusalem, such as texts written in 1043-46, according to which the relics kept in the monastery of San Michel de Cuchar were acquired in 974 by Abbot Gary during a trip to Rome and to Palestine. Less known are the links of the famous Catalan warlord Arnau Mir de Tost. As early as 1068, Arsenda, his wife, wrote her will in which she bequeathed her golden diadem, ornamentum meum de caput que est in auro, to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Arnau Mir de Tost's will of 1072 also contains a substantial donation of 100 gold mancusi to the Holy Sepulchre. The background of these bequests has long been completely unknown. Only recently has a small Lipsanoteca been opened in the parish church of Santa Maria de Torreta, which reveals that Arnau Mir de Tost did in fact make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Lipsanoteca contains a small parchment note, and that's what you see here, which relates that the relics, earth from the Holy Sepulchre, wax lit by the miraculous Easter fire, and incense were brought to Catalonia by the Pyrenean warrior. This incidental finding points us to an important trans-Mediterranean route between the Iberian Peninsula and Jerusalem, and I mean pilgrimages by Iberian Christians. And therefore, in the last part of my contribution, I will present some findings that show how intense the trans-Mediterranean relationships of people, and thus probably also of artifacts, was between Jerusalem and the northeast of the Iberian Peninsula already in the 11th century, and thus before the Christian conquest of Jerusalem by the Crusaders. The conquest of Jerusalem by a Christian army in 1099 and the subsequent establishment of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, marked a turning point in the history of pilgrimages. For the first time, Latin Christians ruled the city of David. Thus, and this in turn facilitated communication between Latin Europe and the Levant and increased connectivity across the Mediterranean, including Christian pilgrimages. The number of men and women who undertook the arduous journey by sea or by land increased considerably, as many studies have already shown. But in contrast, pilgrimages to Jerusalem in the period before the Crusades are much more difficult to capture, analyze, and quantify. There are several narrative sources that provide information about individual and group journeys in the 11th century. These chronicles and hagiographic texts need to be complemented by other, less literary material that can provide new insights into the life, mentality, and intentions of earlier medieval pilgrimages. Private documents often fulfill these conditions better than narrative sources, as they provide information about the identity of individuals as well as about their social and economic contexts. There's one kind of document whose drafting is often directly linked to a pilgrimage, and I mean medieval wills. These documents were drafted under very specific circumstances that are generally noted in their clauses and expository narratives, the most common of which was the ill health of the testator. But the second most frequent reason was an eminent or lengthy journey, a military expedition, a commercial voyage, or a pilgrimage, which necessarily entailed some dangers for the traveler. Pilgrims' wills could therefore provide valuable information about the underlying motives for a journey, especially as they were usually written before the traveler departed. I would like to summarize the results of an analysis of 73 Catalan testaments from the 11th century that explicitly refer to an eminent or accomplished pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In many studies on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the Middle Ages, authors describe the pilgrim's aim in rather general terms. They refer indistinctly to Palestine, Jerusalem, or the holy places. But exactly which spaces or objects exerted attraction on believers? Which attractors of the Holy Land need to be differentiated analytically? An analysis of the sources concerning pilgrims and crusaders, chronicles and sermons, letters and testaments, allow us to differentiate and to determine three such attractors. First, the Holy Land. Second, the city of Jerusalem. And third, the tomb of Christ. But it is equally important to take into account diachronic fluctuations and changes, since during the 11th and the 12th century, the influence of these attractors was not consistent. If one understands space not as a container in which events or interactions occur, but as a social and cultural construction, as embodied space in which human beings shape space through their activities, then one must necessarily also take into account changes in the cultural construction of space and places. How did the testators describe their purpose? What are the points of attraction they mentioned? Can one unveil the construction of cultural space with the help of testaments? How was the pilgrimage to the Holy Land affected by physical changes in the 11th century Jerusalem? Sorry. In the few private documents dating from the late 10th and early decades of the 11th century, the testators usually name Jerusalem as the destination of their journey. However, with the rise of pilgrimages at the beginning of the 11th century, the references change. Now the tomb of Christ becomes the predominant goal of the pilgrims. Finally, a certain change can be discerned in the decades before the First Crusade, around 1080. From the 80s of the 11th century on, Jerusalem grows in importance and is repeatedly singled out as the pilgrims' or crusaders' goal. Certainly, the First Crusade continued to be strongly marked by devotion to the sepulchre and many testators still pointed to the sepulchre as their goal, as you see here. Cupiens ire in servitium Dei et eius sancti sepulchri, that is a crusader time testament, right? But its predominance, the predominance of the Holy Sepulchre, was not as absolute as it had been in previous decades. A subtle shift of focus can be discerned as attention now encompassed both the sites of Christ's death and those of his earthly activities. In the following decades, the city of Jerusalem, the place where Christ had confronted the money changers, where the apostolic community had gathered, etc., gained momentum. And you can also see the penitential dimension here in this document. The foundation of the Latin states of the Levant further increased the points of contact between the Middle East and Latin Europe, and thus between the royal city of Jerusalem and Catalonia. Now, not only pilgrims traveled, but settlers and colonists moved to the conquered territories, merchants founded houses and traded regularly between the shores of the Mediterranean, warriors traveled east, aristocrats and ecclesiastics made their career there. All this contributed to making Jerusalem a much more concrete reality in collective consciousness of Latin Christians than in the decades before the conquest. The results obtained through the analysis of Catalan wills are supported by other regional sources. The ecclesiastical consecrations, for example, corroborate the growing importance of the sepulchre of Christ in the 11th century. Buildings dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre had been erected earlier, but their number was limited and they were not built as replicas of the authentic Sepulchrum Domini. But in Catalonia and in other places, several chapels were dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre from the 1020s onwards. In fact, no fewer than 11 churches and chapels received this dedication in this period. All these indirect relations between Palestine and Catalonia may have led to the displacement of Jerusalemite objects, relics, reliquaries, etc. that crossed the Mediterranean. So let me come to a conclusion. I began this paper by analyzing how Palestine and Jerusalem became the setting for miraculous narratives of Iberian Christian piety, and then shifted the scene to focus on artifacts linked to Jerusalem through legends and miraculous stories. These artifacts developed to a very specific, real and transcendental power as actants. The relics kept in the Holy Ark of Oviedo are significant examples of how these actants actually exercised a concrete and particular function, even experienced what I called an artifact biography or an artifact career. Now, as far as I know, the relics of the Holy Ark are examples of a fictitious, not real, trans-Mediterranean connectivity. We have therefore focused on Staroteche, and that were part of the great medieval circulation of relics and reliquaries. And in this context, reliquaries served as important vehicles of medieval communication. We do not usually know how these objects reach their destination, but an analysis of different sources, both written and material sources, has pointed to some clues for a better understanding of these routes of diffusion. Thanks to them, it has been possible to demonstrate that there were indeed correlations between the migration of these objects across the Mediterranean and the mobility of Christians, Iberian Christians, in the 11th and 12th centuries, especially those from the northeast of the Iberian Peninsula. Devotion to the Holy Land was further strengthened by the construction and dedication of churches and chapels, the transfer of relics, and other material and mnemonic devices, as demonstrated by the systematic reading of dedication charters. Finally, the study of an unusually large corpus of testaments of wills from the 11th century have extended our knowledge on the veneration of Jerusalem in general and the tomb of Christ in particular. The very notion and the nature of these documents allows a more direct approach to Jerusalem pilgrimage and pilgrims themselves than that provided by narrative sources, because we receive valuable information about social, economic, spiritual contexts of the testator. These sources therefore corroborate narrative sources and texts about pilgrimage in the 11th and 12th century. Thus, The documentation examined has made it possible, I hope, to produce a study situated at the interspace between history, art history, and materiality studies that opens a window on medieval Mediterranean connectivity and its material embodiment. Thanks a lot for listening to me for so long.